The narratio is a critical piece of any argumentative or rhetorical exercise. The purpose here is to begin to introduce the landscape of the issue, problem, or event you are discussing. In the case of the academic essay, it lays out the facts pertinent to your topic in a context that makes sense for your audience and your issue. So, what is the narratio? There are varying definitions, and I'm sure you remember some of them. Things like background information, the statement of facts, catching your audience up to speed, etc., etc. And these are all helpful starting points, but to write a truly great narratio, we need to dive into some of the tools specific to this part of discourse. The first thing to remember is that the narratio's primary persuasive tool is ethos. You need to show in this section that you know what you're talking about, that you're knowledgeable about this subject. You need to show that you have a clear vision of what your opponent or opponents believe, and you need to take your opponent's point of view seriously. In this way, we can show arete, phronesis, and eunoia. But then, how are we going to actually show this ethos? Well, there's more than one way to satisfactorily order the facts pertaining to your issue. Part of your job is to order them in a way that is most convincing to your particular audience and for your particular issue. And what works well for one paper will be terrible for another. But there are a set of principles we can use to develop a narratio that is strong for your particular circumstances. There are two main principles, and I encourage you to use them both and intertwine them in your narratio. First, you want to consider the history of the great conversation as it pertains to your topic. And second, you want to use stasis theory. Let's take these individually. In exploring the history of the great conversation, you want to recall that you're taking up an important issue. And because your issue is important, it will be contentious. Consider that unless you're picking an issue whose roots are younger than you are, so 18 years old or less, there's going to be many people much smarter and possibly much wiser than you who have written extensively about this subject. So in effect, you're going to be exploring the historical context of your issue here. When is the beginning of your topic in history, and who first brought up this question? When did this issue first become problematic? In what context did these things become problematic? And how has your issue evolved over time? Who or what events were major players in its evolution? And who are the major players of today? How does their position relate to the position that others in history took? If possible, you want to weave these into a bit of a story or a historical narrative to keep the reader's interest. And you want to keep things brief. If you need, you can always add more pertinent information into the confirmatio later on. The way you treat your facts here will end up playing a big role in how persuasive your argument will be. And so you have to treat the facts responsibly. If you have a scornful or scoffing tone when describing your opponent's viewpoints, those who currently hold that position will be turned off. Likewise, it might suit you to get a few key facts sorted right away, so that predisposes your opponents to take you seriously as an authority. Here's a bit of an illustrative example. Planned Parenthood, a nefarious abortion clinic, was started by Margaret Sanger, a notorious white feminist eugenicist who used her pro-contraception ideology to reduce the reproduction rates of, in her words, lesser races. She once wrote to an ally that, quote, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population." She started her first contraception clinic in Brownsville, New York, a black neighborhood in Brooklyn. Compare this to this next example. Planned Parenthood was started by Margaret Sanger, a feminist who popularized the contraception movement in the United States. In a letter to an ally, she once wrote, quote, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out the idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members." Some have interpreted this as evidence that she was a racist eugenicist who wanted nothing more than to exterminate black indigenous peoples of color. Others disagree and say that the proper interpretation of this quote is that she is explicitly not attempting to undermine the Negro population. Okay, let's compare these. Of course, what I do here may or may not work for your own narratio, so let your intuition be your guide. I'm sure you can see here what I mean about respecting the facts. In the first example here, I use unceremonious, inflammatory, and direct language, such as notorious, ideology, lesser races. I even picked an ugly picture. In so doing, I have recruited the people who are already on my apparent side of this argument and have ostracized my opposition. I think it would be fair to say that those of you listening who are in favor of Planned Parenthood were immediately turned off by what I had to say, as if I wasn't really taking the argument seriously. Similarly, those of you who are in agreement with his apparent position probably rallied behind me. Further, if I had maybe gone the other way and totally understated the case here, the opposite would be true. I'd lose my supporters entirely, and likely my opponents wouldn't think that I know what I'm talking about. Both scenarios end up being counter to your purpose, especially if you have a particularly contentious issue. Let's think about the second case. Here, I take a more measured approach. It still might be clear that I'm against abortion, etc., but I take the facts more seriously as if I care about the opposition and their opinions. The goal here is to arrive at a place where all sides are basically in agreement about the landscape of the issue. If your case is similar, you can dive into why your interpretation of the facts and issue is correct in your confirmatio. But in some cases and situations, it might even be advantageous to begin with an overtly hostile or even overtly docile approach. Do what works best for your particular issue. So, if the goal here is to arrive in agreement about the landscape of the issue, how do we do that? We're going to use our second technique, stasis theory. The goal of stasis theory is to arrive at stasis with all sides of an issue. And I just kind of used the word in the definition. So let's think about it this way. We want to present all sides of the issue in a way that everyone, regardless of viewpoint, can agree. And then we want to point out areas of disagreement. This means that you want to lay out the complexities of the problem you are solving or the landscape of the inquiry that you're engaging in. Remember, usually you have not yet introduced your argument and your position. That comes next in the partitio. At this stage, most of you are just giving a 30,000-foot overview or the lay of the land. The next question then is, how do we achieve stasis? There are ways of thinking about it, but your senior thesis workbook does a really great job of guiding you through it in chapter 8. If you haven't already, I really encourage you to review this section and complete the relevant exercises. All right, there are 4 traditional stasis points. You can almost think of these as the common topics, but for the Narratio. They are fact, definition, quality, and policy. Let's take these individually. Fact asks the question, what is true? It focuses on the matter at hand. What is really happening here? In many cases, there will be much consensus here among all sides and just a few points of contention. For example, we might all agree that global temperatures are rising on average across the last 50 years, but we might argue about whether or not this is caused primarily by human activity. This is a disagreement upon the facts at hand. Next is definition. Definition asks the question, what is it? In this stasis point, you will try to identify how the issue is classified or understood. For example, how exactly are the terms climate change and global warming defined? Are they different or synonymous? Clearly defining your key and problematic terms is critical to any argument. But more than identifying individual terms, you want to focus in on the boundaries of your conversation. Are there topics that are related that you are specifically not touching? Let the reader know. This can also serve to set the parameters for the reader's evaluation of your claims. For example, you might state that the case you're making is not sociological, but rather theological or historical, depending on your context. Ultimately, the stasis point seeks to define the problem clearly so that your readers know what you mean by your terms and can clearly identify the parameters of your argument. The next point of stasis is quality, and this is all about how serious is it. Ultimately, people might disagree upon the seriousness of a specific issue. We might know that the Earth is warming, and we might agree on the definition of climate change, but we might disagree upon how important the topic is. The importance of a topic is related to a series of dichotomies. So concerning your topic, think about this. Which parts are good and bad? Right and wrong? Honorable and dishonorable? Consider if harm is being done, and if so, to whom? Consider if justice or injustice is being done, by whom and against whom. This stasis point also concerns the relevance of your topic, specifically to your audience. How is your topic and issue relevant to others? Compare people in the United States, people in Virginia, people in Charlottesville, at Covenant. To whom and to what extent is this issue relevant? Lastly, quality is also concerned with urgency. Why does this issue matter right now? And why are you talking about it right now? Okay, lastly, we have policy. Policy asks questions like, should action even be taken in the first place? What are some of the options for addressing the problem, and which one is likely to be most advantageous? Which effects will each of the options have? We put policy last because we cannot reach stasis on policy until we agree on facts, definition, and quality. Finding common ground is vital to even reach the possibility of persuading someone towards a particular policy. Oftentimes, your policy won't even show up until your peroratio. Again, employ these techniques in a way that suits your issue and your audience. A further point about policy. We often think about policy as a political policy, or go ahead and contact your local representative. That's not really what we're aiming at here. What we're aiming at here is something more like, this is how you should think about this topic, and this is how it's going to play a role in your life specifically. That's what we mean by policy. What should we do? How should we live? All right, a few closing remarks as we finish this rather lengthy video. Sorry about that. Firstly, you will likely not need to employ all of these techniques or stasis points we mentioned earlier. Use your best judgment to determine what is most important for your audience to know. Too little, and your audience won't think you know what you're talking about. Too much extraneous information, and your audience will become bored or confused or both, and you'll be bogged down by a huge narratio and too little confirmatio. Secondly, depending on your issue, you'll want to change which pieces of information go where. It's best, or is it best to begin where people disagree, or should you begin with pieces of agreement and then slowly develop into areas where people disagree? The option is yours, and it will depend on the tactics you're taking to guide your audience down the path of truth. Finally, in your final draft, you'll want to attempt to intertwine the narratio in such a way that you generate a compelling picture. If done carefully and subtly, you might even convince your audience at this stage through just your presentation of facts, or at least predispose them towards your confirmatio. I hope this has helped you think carefully through your narratio. As always, I'm happy to receive feedback and suggestions. Did I miss anything? Do you want more information about a particular topic? Let me know, and I'd be happy to help by meeting with you or making a new video. Good luck with your narratio.